So we're pleased to have George back with us on the show to discuss what the post-pandemic economy might look like, how frightening it might be, and how you might still survive and be prepared for it. Glad you could be with us, George.
Robert, it's great to be here. I need a cigar, buddy, like you.
Yes,
I
exactly.
got to have you send me down some of those cigars.
Exactly. Well, I mean, luckily there's not yet a cigar shortage, though a lot of the cigar shops have been closed down the last couple of weeks.
Right.
And there's been some import issues from a particular location that has been problematic, unfortunately. But hopefully they'll cure at least that issue amongst the wild range of economic issues we're seeing in really almost unprecedented, unparalleled territory. We're seeing we're going in with a whole bunch of central banks experimenting based on what you identified recently as sort of a recency bias, believing that what they did in 08, 09 magically could continue in any context or any circumstance. And we're already seeing that that is not necessarily translating. As the Fed's balance sheet goes way up, velocity of money is going down, more reports of people hoarding cash. So there's whether or not, even when they lift the shutdowns, which who knows when that will happen in large parts of the Western world, it's not clear that that new world will look anything like the old one.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing you have to look at is the supply side of the equation, because everyone gets the demand side. Just like you said, we go into lockdown, everyone's staying in their house. Very few people are out driving around or just spending money. So we get that. But most people don't look at the supply side. So I did an example in one of my videos of just a typical McDonald's, and I looked at their profit and loss. And you see they've got about a 5.7% profit margin at the end of the day. But most of their costs are fixed from a standpoint of their employees. So just long story short, it makes it very difficult for them to lower their prices. Typically, they just have to go out of business. So if they go out of business, you have a reduction in the supply. At some point in time, although the demand might shrink substantially, you have the supply go down so low that it still increases prices. Another example that I used is airlines, and this was just totally anecdotal. But a very good friend of mine, Jason Hartman at jasonhartman.com, great real estate expert, but he's a very good macro thinker as well. He sent me just a flight that he looked up, just going from Miami to Los Angeles, and he went back about 90 days prior to the coronavirus. And what you saw was the flight was right around, let's say, $350. And once we started seeing this collapse in the stock market and everything was just imploding back in the middle of March, you saw prices for this flight just drop all the way down to like $100 a round trip. I mean, it's crazy. But then what you've seen more recently in the last couple of weeks is prices of the exact same flight go up, and they're now more expensive than they were prior to the coronavirus. But the catch is there's a lot fewer flights. So I think people need to really look at the supply side of the equation, like I was saying earlier, and understand that we could see prices increase while at the same time the unemployment rate is going up substantially, very similar to what happened in the 1970s.
It's very much. It's what's fascinating is we're in unprecedented territory, and that we could have inflation in some assets, deflation. Well, I should say inflation in the ways it impacts ordinary people and what they buy every day, the basket of goods that the CPI is mostly based on. While we see deflation in certain assets, may see unemployment continue to rise to the stagflation you're talking about, while the dollar stays strong in foreign markets that they can't even figure out a way to get it down because of a wide range of dollar-denominated debt around the world. And to give you to your airline example, I have a lot of people who travel all across the country for my work. And right when the collapse hit, they could get, I made the mistake of not buying them. They could buy air tickets in advance for $29 coast to coast. That's how cheap some of the airline tickets were. Now, because they're just canceling flights routinely, like Southwest will put you on there and then cancel 2/3 of the flights the next day. I was supposed to be in Tennessee last weekend for a protest gathering. My flight got canceled the morning of. And the average prices, Southwest and others, is skyrocketing. In fact, they're higher now than they have typically been for almost any place in the country that people want to get to. And it is because of what you're talking about, dramatically shrinking supply. And there was talk today, American Airlines is just going to disband a bunch of its planes early. It's going to put them out to retirement, put them out to pasture. And that same dynamic is taking place. And what's interesting to me is the biggest discussion of what should be happening economically is mostly not happening in the public discourse. Outside of your channel and independent channels, most ordinary people, when I talk about, hey, by the way, the Fed is, did you know the Fed's balance sheet is up a couple of $1 trillion? They think that's the stimulus bill. They don't know that it's something separate, something distinct, something different, and that the Fed's balance sheet is just going through the roof. And what's most disturbing is if this was supposed to work, if this modern monetary theory and helicopter money was supposed to inspire spending, it's not happening yet. And I assume that there's a risk it just doesn't come back at all. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, the first thing people need to understand when you look at the Fed's balance sheet is they assume that it's going up as a result almost exclusively of the Fed buying U.S. assets. But what they're not understanding is a lot of that rise has to do with dollar swap lines. So what are those? That's when the Fed is bailing out other countries. That's the short answer. So how it works is the Fed will set up a swap line with another central bank. Let's call it the Bank of England. So the Bank of England needs dollars because so many entities in the UK have dollar-denominated debt. It's very hard to find these dollars to service the debt. So it creates all these problems. So the Fed steps in and says, listen, you guys can send us your currency. We'll give you the dollars, and then we can swap back at a later date. So now the question is, okay, if they swap back, let's say in 90 days, how do we know the Fed isn't just going to roll it over and allow them to continue to keep the dollars, just like they have with the repo market? And so I think if Americans knew, well, first and foremost, to your point, they don't really understand what's going on with the Fed's balance sheet. But even if they did understand what's going on with the balance sheet, if they took it a step further, I think they'd really start to question the motives of the Fed. And also, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but I want to go back to your earlier point about property taxes increasing. It has to do with these dollar swap lines. And I did an interview today with Marin Katusa, and he pointed out some very interesting information that these dollar swap lines could be weaponized because these other countries need the dollars so badly. The United States can and has set up swap lines with just specific countries. So if they leave you out in the cold, then it's almost like putting sanctions on a specific economy that they might not like. So the retaliation, what he's seen, is some of these countries have suggested that they might take over U.S. company assets in their jurisdiction, such as gold mines or such as maybe an oil reserve. And the reason I'm saying that is because it shows us that when times get tough, governments, whether it's the United States or any other government around the world, will find whoever has the resources or the cash, and they'll come after that entity, whether it's an individual, a corporation, it just doesn't matter. And it goes back to the property taxes. The worse it gets here in the United States, and I think we're at a very minimum going into a recession. It might be a depression, we'll see. But as American citizen, don't think that the government isn't going to come after you as well if you're one of those people that has resources. So how do they do that? First and foremost, they're going to jack property taxes. That's why it was so obvious to me back a month or two ago that this would most likely be the outcome, because those are the people with the assets. So the government will go after and they'll try to pick your pocket any way they can. And I think that we'll get higher taxes across the board. It won't just be in property taxes. But then you take it a step further, and they admit that they're trying to create inflation. So what is inflation? It's just another indirect tax that steals the purchasing power of savers. So I guess my point is that expect this in the future. And unfortunately, the worse things get, the more you're going to see the governments being intrusive and trying to take your purchasing power, whether it's directly through taxes or indirectly through inflation.
Precisely. I think one of the backdrops that briefly sort of popped up in the public debate, but only the sort of the tip of the iceberg of the issues, is everything related to municipal bonds of governments and state government debts. You combine that with state pensions, which have been badly underfunded and in a huge problem. And part of the sort of almost political quid pro quo that's been happening with, hey, corporation, we'll give you some tax cuts so that you will go in and buy back your debt, basically do buybacks of your stock, do corporate debt, and use that money to buy back your stock. And in turn, that will help boost the bond so it won't be a junk bond, so that the pension funds can be invested in a wide range of ways, so they can at least get close to that 7-8% they're supposed to be doing when they're already badly, terribly underfunded. Well, you combine that, you compound the state debt problem that already existed. You combine that with the state pension fund problem that's off the charts. And then they've been shutting down their economies in a lot of these Democratic states, California, Illinois, New York. And that's why they're screaming, we better get a huge, massive federal government bailout, not just the Fed doing what they're doing and propping up the muni bond market, but also we want massive cash, because otherwise they're always going to be in this trouble. But they're using COVID-19 as the pretext to get a bailout. It's almost like they're deliberately extending the shutdown in the hopes that they can use that as the thing to blame to get that in. Could you explain to people what that constellation of issues and how that ultimately shows up in things like state property taxes and probably on the federal level, a recommended wealth tax?
Well, just to simplify it as much as I can, let's say you've got a pension fund and their liabilities, or what they promise to the people who have been putting in all these years, the workers, is a 7% return on their money. So that's their target. That's what they have to achieve. What happens, the Federal Reserve comes in and drops interest rates to 0% for, call it 8 years, but we've gone back and forth, a very artificially low interest rate environment. Well, if you're a pension fund that has to put all this money to work and you have to get a 7% return, how do you do that in an environment with 0% interest rates? It becomes very, very difficult. The only way to achieve your objective is to go further out the risk curve. All that means is you just take more risk than you otherwise would. So if you're that pension fund and you can get, let's say, a 6% return on a 10-year treasury, which you normally would, well, then you're golden. You've got nothing to worry about. But if you can't, then how do you get the 7% return? Well, a few ways. Well, you can go into corporate debt, which you talked about earlier. You could go into triple B debt, which is right on the cusp. You could go into private equity. You could purchase equities outright, and things that are politically correct to buy. And what I'm talking about there is, like, you've got the pension fund in California, and they buy Tesla or Uber, something like that. Well, why are they buying that? Well, let's be honest, because it makes them look good. It's kind of it's the political thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a good investment for the people that they owe the money to. But they also lever up. I want to make sure people are clear there. So they'll not only go into the corporate bond market, which in and of itself is more risky than a treasury. They'll do it at, let's say, 50% leverage. So if they're getting that 3.5% return, well, then they say, well, we got to have 7. So they take out a bunch of leverage and go into the market. And so you just compound the risk. And it gets to a situation where they're already way underfunded. And the more problems they have, the more risk they'll take. Well, the more risk they take, if we get a down market or a recession, the more in the hole they're going to be. Then the only release valve for them to fill that gap in their pension is to come after the taxpayer. Again, they've got to, it's got to come from somewhere. So that's kind of the last resort, and that's where you see it play out in increasing property taxes. But I think they'll increase sales tax, property taxes, you name it, and it's going up. I mean, if you're someone that is a producer, you have a mid-sized business, you're an entrepreneur in a state like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, I mean, they're going to be coming after you. I can promise you. I would get out of there as fast as I could.
Exactly. No doubt about it, because I see it as twofold. That tax power is often about control and power. So that I do a lot of tax law representation. It's sort of what I made my bones in before I went into a broad area of law, civil and constitutional law. But even though it was constitutional issues that got me into tax law, because they were targeting people for their political beliefs, people like Irwin Schiff, people like Wesley Snipes, a range of people. who were mostly being targeted. And I started to understand it more because the government was paranoid of tax dissent more than almost anything in the legal political spectrum, because they understood America was founded when a few people got together and decided those taxes weren't fair, equitable, or little d democratic. And that almost every revolution in the history of the world is tied to people who just decide not to pay taxes. That's why Noam Chomsky decided that was the most effective means to resist Vietnam. He decided was actually if 25% of the people did not pay their income tax in protest. And they immediately shut that down by prosecuting a range of people, of course. But they're scared and terrified of it because it's so key to their control, so key to their power. Because tax control, all the tax loopholes allow you to favor certain and say, hey, if you do this, this, and this, we'll give you special rewards. If you don't, we're going to punish you over here. That's what a lot of the tax laws are written to do, is to basically it's a policy prescription disguised as a tax law. And in that same context, given the underlying problems our local governments have that they've kept a good lid on for the most part, Trump talked about it a little bit today and yesterday, said, why should we be bailing out states that have had 25 years of problems? But they've created the pandemic has been a perfect pretext. I remember you had somebody on your shows talking about anybody smart that was in the market that had problems on their books should be going in and fixing those little book problems and just attributing it to the pandemic as quickly and as easily as they can. But in this context, you get to like a wealth tax, and it's a wonderful title. I give them credit. It's a much better. It's like the estate tax. It sounds much better than saying we want to tax dead people. The wealth tax is effectively a property tax that legally, constitutionally, is not supposed to happen in the United States at a federal level. But there's more and more and more talk of it, and I see it just as I see UBI coming into guise of momentary, temporary help, transitory help. We're seeing the same thing happen on the other side in terms of more talk of the wealth tax and the issues that it could impose, and almost creating like a caste-like system between essential and non-essential people. Just the label sounds like something out of 19th century India. And you had a good YouTube this week, a good video this week about what happens when you're getting better benefits from unemployment than you could if you go back into the labor market. I'm hearing from small employers that that's a problem. So we already have a spending problem. What happens if we compound it with people who don't even want to go back into employment because the government's told them they'll give them more money if they stay at home?
Yeah, it goes back to inflation. I mean, that's going to destroy supply, because what you do is you set up this perverse environment where employers are competing with the government for their employees, like who will pay them the most. So if the government is willing to pay them, let's say 50% more than the employer, well, the employer can't pay that much because typically they're going to pay the employee what they can produce. If your employee can produce, let's say, $100,000 a year, then you can't pay them 200. That math doesn't work. So if the government's paying them 200, you can't compete. If you don't have any of your employees, you go out of business. And let's take it a step further. So that is inflationary at a certain point. Maybe short term, it could be deflationary because you have so many entities go out of business. But over the long run, you have fewer goods and services that are created right here in the United States. Well, people are still going to want to consume. They still want to see stuff on the shelves at Walmart or Target. So what ends up happening is you start importing more from foreign countries. So we're importing more of their goods and services so we don't have to create them ourselves. And the only thing we have to do is export these little green pieces of paper. It's great. You can just sit back on your couch and have everything made for you. And all you have to do is click a couple buttons on your computer screen, print up $1 trillion. It goes over to China or India or Japan or wherever, and then they ship you all of these goods and services. The problem is, what do the foreigners do with the dollars? They come right back and they buy U.S. denominated assets or USD assets. So let's look at treasuries as an example, or real estate or bonds or corporate bonds or equities, anything that's denominated in dollars. They want to find productive assets to put the dollars they're making to work. So you have this situation where we produce less and less stuff in the United States, while at the same time we're selling more and more and more of our assets to foreigners. So you get to a point theoretically where we don't create any of our own stuff. Foreigners own all of our assets. So they control everything. They control the amount we consume, because to consume, you first have to produce, right? So if all of our producing is being done overseas, they control our level of consumption, and they control all the assets in our country. And going back to that video you referenced, I at the end of the video, I read the definition of slavery. And I didn't come to any conclusion, but if you look at the proper definition of slavery and where we would be as a society in the United States, it's very darn close, I can tell you that. And going back to your original point, the more we subsidize people and incentivize people to stay at home, the closer we're coming to that end result.
Exactly. I mean, I always think of it as that scene from The Matrix where you see all the human beings caught up in the machines and they're creating a virtual reality to distract them, but mostly they're just treated as consuming machines, if you will, just sort of in the system and have no real power or control themselves. Because what's terrifying is that they're starting to come into place something you could call a coherent plan, but it's not necessarily one that looks good for ordinary people. You're seeing Wall Street favored over Main Street. You did a good video on that as well. You're seeing the Fed bail out the stock market, but not bail out the small businessmen. You're seeing them discourage employees, and then you have shutdown orders that effectively prohibit small businesses from even acting. A lot of small businesses only had 30 days of reserves. A lot of them are already done and dead. We're going to see that, I think, when the economy reopens in some states. We're going to, I already know places, been around 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, gone, done, finito, simply because of what happened here. And it's almost like what they're creating is an American consumer class who's completely dependent upon the government for their only source of means, and increasingly will be dependent upon foreign governments and nations for the actual production of their goods and the purchases of their debts. And I thought one of the other things you pointed out good was, at some point, if we won't be able to inflate our way out of the debt without running the risk that all of a sudden nobody wants to buy that debt anymore, in particularly foreign nations. And it was interesting to me today when I saw India talk about they're going to issue a special bond that's going to be gold-backed just to get people to buy their bonds. What's your thoughts about that side of the equation?
Well, again, people have recency bias, and I think the recency bias is that we'll never see inflation again because we haven't seen it for a lot, or people think that we haven't seen it. If you look at just the government statistics with the CPI, and
we'll be right back with George right after the break. Sorry about that, George.
British are coming. The British are coming. You are about to embark on a great debate. And one small step for man. America first. Ask not what your country.
Welcome back to American Countdown. We'll be taking your calls in the bottom half of the hour. You can call 877-789-2539. That's 877-789-2539. Or 512 if you're calling internationally, where George is located safely, securely outside of aspects of the United States currently, which may be wise and sage. 512-646-1776. That's 512-646-1776. As we look at this sort of matrix-type economy, the concern I have is that when you combine the Fed buying up U.S. corporate equities, talking today they're going to start buying up U.S. corporate equities with the Treasury of U.S. oil companies. That's basically sounds a lot like nationalization of oil companies effectively. They're just calling it by the different label. Buying up other equities, buying up state and municipal government bonds and debt, which means they could be the principal or primary creditor, which you don't have to watch a show like Billions or others to figure out what that can look like of a local government, how coercive it can be. People can go back and look what happened to San Diego County back in the 90s and early 2000s. That basically what happens is the Fed could be the voting shareholder, if they wanted it effectively, through their special vehicle units of large U.S. corporations, governments across the country, within the United States. They're also controlling what happens with the money supply to a certain degree based on what they're doing and our relationships to foreign governments. And at the same time, increasing taxing power by state and local governments to satisfy some of these credit obligations and other duties. And at the same time, encouraging people to stay at home or ordering they stay at home for the time being, but incentivizing it and creating a lifestyle to see how accustomed they get to it with these basically uniform basic income. And already Nancy Pelosi is talking about extending the $1,200 a month to make it permanent, on top of unemployment insurance being expanded so that it's higher than a lot of your businesses can actually meaningfully compete with. While the Main Street is being wiped out, you combine it and you start to get a combined story of this being a massive power grab by the Fed and the government over people's ordinary everyday lives, to where people are economically dependent on them, have very little economic independence from them. It's like the running story I've said is that we would always take 77 years of American freedom over 78 years of Cuban-style social control. And I've argued that as it relates to the pandemic. Most Americans would choose 1 year less on their life expectancy if it meant 77 years of American freedom. But it looks like we're increasingly taking some of the Cuban social control techniques and starting to apply aspects of it economically. I mean, what Castro did very early on when he ran into economic trouble was ultimately shut down the small businesses. It took him about 6-7 years to do it. But then after that, he's nationalized most of the U.S. Domestic industry that was located there within Cuba. And the government ended up, of course, ultimately running everything. That it seems like we are on a correlated path to that potential outcome, which could even be more compounded if we end up developing a government-based digital currency and the kind of controls that it could impose, using as a pretext the problems we're currently experiencing with the dollar in this bifurcated world of inflation potentially domestically and a too strong dollar internationally. What's your thoughts about is how much of a risk are we facing, unless there's more political and social resistance to that, of that kind of dystopia becoming our matrix-driven economy in the future?
I think we're definitely headed for a digital currency. That's for sure. Just to focus on that part of your statement, because it gives the government just too much power. And I'm not a big fan of politicians, as you probably know, and I don't think they're the smartest tools in the shed. But once they start to understand the type of control it will give them, I just can't understand how they're going to ignore it. And you also see the Treasury, and you see a lot of the public sector, a lot of the federal government are hiring individuals that were in the private sector that worked at a lot of these crypto companies, such as Coinbase. And obviously, I mean, the writing's on the wall. And I don't think the typical American really understands how much control this gives the government. They just see it as kind of an electronic dollar, and they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, I mean, is that really a big deal, Robert? I mean, all the dollars right now are electronic. I can't even tell you the last time I used cash. I just use my debit card and it electronically goes to the business. And we pretty much already have an electronic dollar, or a digital currency, if you will. What they don't understand is that this is a completely different system, in the sense that the Treasury, or maybe the Federal Reserve, would have a ledger system. And every single currency unit that they create electronically that would go to the American public in the form of, let's say, UBI, and it would go right to their cell phone. They just download we'll call it the Fed app, and the Fed would just transfer that money directly to them once a month, $1,000, $2,000, whatever. But each one of these currency units has a tracking number. So it can be programmed. Each one of these, they're not electronic dollars, they're pieces of software. So if the Fed wants to, they could say, okay, no more spending on gas-powered cars. Just using this as an example. And so what would happen is all we'll call them the Fed coins that are now on your Fed app that you've received from the government, and everyone will gladly do it, because who doesn't want this free money? Who doesn't want free purchasing power? But then what happens is they put all these stipulations that if you try to run and spend your Fed coins at the local car dealership for a gas-powered car, it just doesn't work. And so that's an example of how they would control the demand side. They'd also control the supply side, from the sense that if they didn't want a producer, or if they didn't like a specific company, all they would do is just turn them off, and they wouldn't have access to any more of these Fed coins, and they're basically out of business. Also, if they didn't like you for whatever reason, and let's just say that they were worried about taxpayers leaving the United States because they just didn't like what was going on. They didn't like the environment. They didn't like the lack of freedom. And I mean, to your earlier point, if we see anything in the future because of this virus, like we saw in 9/11, I mean, you're going to have, I even hate to think of the restrictions on our freedoms moving forward. But let's just say you're a person that doesn't want any part of that. Well, if they've, I mean, how, if there's no cash, they could just say, okay, Robert, you know what? We don't want you leaving the country. You pay a lot of money in taxes, and we want you keeping that money right here. So you're free to leave. Go right ahead, but you just can't take your money. And they have that type of control with they have no currency, or they ban cash and they go to this digital currency. I mean, I could literally go on for the next 2 hours on how bad a digital currency is for individuals who value their personal liberties. But it's something that unfortunately I think we've got to look for, and it's going to be, it's not a matter of when, or excuse me, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when.
Exactly. I mean, and what do you think could be the effective means, if any, of sort of countering that? Like, I've heard people talk about Bitcoin as a potential, having actual physical possession of gold, which is, it's interesting. What you were talking about earlier, I saw a headline today of somebody talking about a government talking about seizing a gold mine somewhere. So that risk is sort of there constantly with governments around the world because of where gold is physically produced and also where it's stored. What do you think can be the counter to that for people attempting to not end up become part of that matrix kind of economy?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I'd take it a step further. So just to reiterate, Bitcoin, I think, is very interesting. I think that gold and silver is kind of the default position. I actually like gold jewelry as well, because if you look throughout history, although a lot of countries have confiscated gold, based on my research, I haven't found a country that's actually confiscated jewelry. So that might be an interesting approach, where let's say you have a $100,000 necklace and you don't like what's going on in the United States. They've banned cash. They have the Fed coin on the Fed app that they won't let you take. Well, you just put that necklace around your neck and you hop on the next flight. You might look like Mr. T for a while, but at least it allows you to take some purchasing power outside of the country. But I think what Americans can do right now, before this happens, take some sort of, try to get ahead of the curve. What I always tell my viewers is make sure that you diversify your portfolio. We all know what that means, but also diversify your political risk and diversify your currency risk. So why not have a bank account overseas or in a country you like? Maybe you enjoy spending time in, we'll call it Switzerland, or you enjoy spending time in Croatia, Montenegro. These are all places that I quite like. But why not set up a bank account the next time you're there? And you don't have to have a lot of money in there, but just set it up so if need be, you always kind of have it as a plan B. And then if you want to take it a step further, maybe you start to apply for residency or a visa in a country like Colombia. I've got some investments here, so I don't really live in Colombia. I travel all over, but because of my investments, I was able to apply for a visa, which after 5 years gives me the right to have a passport. So I have another passport in addition to the U.S. passport. But I've got a lot of assets all over the world and denominated in different currencies. And although many people probably aren't my position, I think they could start doing it at a small scale to just have a plan B. And I mean, what's your downside to that?
Exactly. I always call it jurisdictional diversification, that you don't want to be dependent on one particular banking system, one particular government, one particular central bank, because you never know what's going to happen. I always describe it as, if you were Jewish in Germany in 1930, you didn't know what was coming. But if you had prepared and planned, you wouldn't have to wait for Schindler's List to get out of Dodge. If you had the means and mechanism to do so, having things that are transportable, physical wealth, watches, diamonds, jewelry, all good and useful, because you can carry a lot of money on your physical body in that way. Having multiple forms of currency, having more residencies and citizenships to the degree you can afford that. There are ways to get it in an accessible, affordable way that's becoming more manageable. But at a minimum, have the, I always like the movie Heat, where he says, never have anything in your life that you can't walk out on in 15 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. I always describe that as always be prepared, so that you have like a Born Identity suitcase and you can walk out the door in 15 seconds flat and be wherever else you need to be if something goes wrong with your local governmental system, banking system, or financial system. To sink all of your eggs into one state, into one government, is ill-advised just when you look at the history of governments and you look at human history. And we're seeing that highlighted and accelerated now. So I think that's a fantastic, good recommendation. So thanks, George, for being with us, taking your time out. You can find him on YouTube. You can find him on the Rebel Capitalist podcast. You can find him on Twitter. He has videos up all the time. They're educational. They're affordable. They're affordable because they're free, but they're also accessible. And it's an unusual combination of accessibility and actionability, and taking what can otherwise be very complex ideas and making them accessible to everybody. So you don't have to have a degree in economics to understand the presentation, understand what to look for, understand how to be prepared as we go through these extraordinary times. So thanks for being with us, George.
Thanks for having me, Robert. Can't wait to do it again.
Absolutely.